Single mother sells soldier's necklace. Jeweler uncovers a heartbreaking secret. The door shook under a furious pounding, and a cold voice shouted, "Pay the rent or get out tomorrow." In a dim Brooklyn apartment, Rachel Miller clutched her 3-month-old baby, whose tiny chest struggled for breath. Outside, the city glittered with wealth, but inside, a young widow faced hunger, debt, and the cruel truth that memories could not feed her child. She mixed sugar water, whispering apologies into the night. What would you have done in her place? Welcome to Emotional Echoes, a channel where emotions come alive and every story leaves a lasting echo in your heart. Please subscribe to Emotional Echoes channel. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so more souls can feel these stories. Stay with my video till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far this story spreads. Now, let me tell you what happened next. Rachel Miller was only 28, but her face carried the weight of someone twice her age. In a cramped apartment in Brooklyn, paint peeling from the walls and cold air seeping through the cracked window, she rocked her 3-month-old son in her arms. Little Ethan's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, the sound of his weak heart making every second feel like borrowed time. She had not slept through a single night since his birth. The cries were faint but relentless, the desperate sound of a baby too hungry and too sick to find rest. Rachel mixed a glass of warm water with sugar, her hands shaking, her voice breaking as she whispered to her son that she was sorry. She pressed the bottle to his lips, watching him drink what she knew could never replace milk, her tears falling on his tiny cheeks. Her mind kept circling the same thought. How had life taken her husband in war and left her with nothing but grief, debt, and a child whose heart fought to stay alive? She looked at the shadows on the ceiling and prayed for a miracle that never seemed to come. Then the pounding on the door shattered the fragile silence. The landlady's voice cut through like a knife, loud and merciless. "Rachel, 3 months' rent. Pay or get out tomorrow." Rachel's body shook as if the floor had given way beneath her. She clutched Ethan to her chest, sliding down to the worn carpet, her back against the door. In that moment she felt the cruel truth pressing in from every side. No money, no husband, no help. Only the sound of her baby's faint cry and the echo of a world that had already judged her unworthy. Rachel waited until Ethan fell into a restless sleep before pulling the wooden box from under the bed. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid, revealing the silver chain that had never left her side since the day the folded flag was placed in her arms. The tag glinted faintly in the dim light, Daniel Miller engraved, as if carved into her soul. She pressed the chain against her palm, memories flooding back. The day the officer told her that Daniel had fallen. The day they said the chain had been found over his heart, dented where it had shielded another soldier. She had sworn then, through sobs and trembling hands, that she would never part with it, no matter how empty her life became. Now the vow felt like a cruel test. She whispered to the silence, asking Daniel if he could forgive her. She told him she was not choosing money over love, she was choosing life over loss. Their son's life, the only piece of him that remained. Her tears fell onto the metal, streaking it like new scars. Rachel held the chain to her lips and shut her eyes. It felt like betrayal, like tearing away the last thread binding her to the man she loved. Yet Ethan's shallow breaths from the crib pierced her heart more sharply than any promise. She rose to her feet with the chain in her pocket, her body heavy with grief and determination. At dawn she would walk into the world to give up the one thing she swore to keep because love demanded more than memory. The bell above the glass door chimed as Rachel stepped inside. The jewelry store gleamed like another world, marble floors shining, crystal lights reflecting against rows of diamond necklaces. She hesitated at the threshold, clutching Ethan close, his small whimper drawing quick stares from women draped in furs and men in polished suits. A guard stepped forward, blocking her path with a hard stare. "This is not a pawn shop," he said, his voice sharp and dismissive. Rachel's knees almost gave way, but she pressed the chain into her palm and whispered that she only needed someone to look at it. Her voice cracked as she begged, telling him she had a sick baby who needed milk, who needed more than she could give. Across the room, Jack Thompson was showing a string of pearls to an older couple. His eyes flicked to the door, where the young woman stood trembling under the guard's gaze. Something in her face, in the way she clutched her baby, pulled him closer despite the impatience of his wealthy customers. He raised a hand, signaling the guard to let her pass. Rachel approached slowly, pulling the silver chain from her pocket. Her fingers shook as she held it out, her eyes pleading for him to just see its worth. Jack reached for it, expecting nothing more than a trinket, but the moment the chain touched his hand, he froze. His thumb brushed against the tiny engraving inside the tag. The letters and the symbol etched there were burned into his memory. His pulse quickened, a flood of desert heat, sand, and gunfire rushing back. He remembered the chaos of that night, the whistle of bullets, and the figure who had thrown himself in front of him. His throat tightened as the name surfaced, heavy and undeniable. Daniel Miller. For a moment, the store around him faded. The laughter of rich clients, the polished sparkle of diamonds, even Rachel's desperate gaze, all blurred. He saw only the chain, the mark of his unit, and the ghost of the man who had carried it. His hand trembled, and the pearls he had been showing slipped from his grasp onto the counter. The sound startled the room into silence, every eye turning to watch the unlikely scene unfolding. Rachel's lips trembled as she tried to speak. The weight of silence in the store pressed down on her until she finally broke. She clutched Ethan tighter and sobbed that the chain belonged to her husband, Daniel Miller, who had died in Afghanistan, leaving her with nothing but their sick child. Jack's breath caught as the name cut through him like a blade. His hands shook and his eyes locked on the engraving as if it were glowing. He whispered, almost to himself, that Daniel Miller was the soldier who had taken the bullet meant for him, the man who had saved his life. The room froze. For one suspended moment, the polished world of jewels and wealth was drowned out by the invisible weight of war and sacrifice. But then a man in a tailored suit scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. Some people will say anything to get free money. Rachel's body stiffened. Tears streaked her face, but her voice carried a sharp edge. She told them she did not want pity, she did not want charity, she only wanted her baby to live. The words cracked the air, and her pain echoed through every corner of the store. Jack's vision blurred as memory overtook him. The blinding flash of gunfire, the deafening roar of combat, and Daniel's body pushing him to the ground. He remembered the heavy silence that followed, the silence of one life ending so another could go on. Now, standing in his spotless store surrounded by diamonds, he felt the crushing truth. He lived, and Daniel had not. He stared at Rachel, seeing not just a desperate young mother, but the living reminder of a debt he could never repay. The injustice of her suffering, the cruel judgment of strangers, and the ghost of his friend all collided inside him. His chest ached with guilt, with grief, with the unbearable knowledge that fate had tied their lives together in the cruelest way. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and fear. Rachel sat outside the doctor's office, her arms wrapped around Ethan as if her body alone could shield him. Dr. Susan's words echoed like a verdict. Ethan's surgery had to happen soon. $60,000. Without it, his tiny heart might stop at any moment. Rachel slid to the floor, her knees giving out as she begged under her breath for God to not take the last piece of Daniel from her. She thought she was alone in that hallway until she felt a shadow fall over her. Linda's heels clicked sharply against the tiles, her arms folded, her eyes full of spite. She had followed Rachel from the apartment, curious and cruel. With a bitter smile, she crouched down and hissed that the baby was sick because Rachel was cursed, that nothing good ever came from her worthless life. Then Linda grabbed her arm, yanking her up so hard that Ethan whimpered in fear. The sting of those words cut deeper than any wound. Rachel's face burned with shame, the hallway spinning as patients and nurses turned to look. For a moment she wanted to collapse again, to let the insults bury her. But then Ethan's cry rose against her chest, and something inside her snapped. Her hand flew across Linda's cheek, the sound sharp enough to silence the corridor. Rachel's voice shook the walls as she shouted that no one, not even God's cruelest messenger, would ever curse her child again. Linda staggered back, clutching her face, eyes wide with shock. Nurses rushed forward, but Rachel only tightened her hold on Ethan, her body trembling not from fear but from fury. Her heart pounded as she realized she had crossed a line she never thought she could. Every injustice, every humiliation, every cruel word had burned away, leaving behind only a mother's raw defiance. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was fighting. Rachel sat slumped in the waiting room, Ethan's small body pressed against her chest as if he were part of her own heartbeat. The doors swung open, and Jack stepped in, his face pale with something heavier than sympathy. In his hand, the silver chain glinted, carrying with it the weight of 2 lives. He sat beside her, his voice low but unwavering. He told her Daniel was not just another soldier, but the man who had taken the bullet, meant for him. His life existed only because Daniel had given up his own. Jack's throat tightened as he confessed he had carried that debt every day since, and now he could no longer stand by while Daniel's family faced ruin. Rachel shook her head, clutching the chain to her chest. She said this was all she had left of her husband, that once she let it go, it would feel as though he had never existed. Her voice cracked as she admitted she still kissed the chain some nights, whispering to Daniel as if he might hear. She feared losing it was like erasing him forever. Jack leaned forward, his hand pressed over his heart, his eyes wet with memories. He said the chain was more than a keepsake. It was a debt written into his survival, a debt he must repay. He wanted to buy it for its true value, $75,000, and pay for Ethan's surgery. His voice broke as he told her this was not charity. This was Daniel's legacy living through him. Rachel's body trembled under the weight of the choice. She looked at Ethan, his fragile breaths whispering against her skin, and back at the chain that felt heavier than iron in her hand. For a long moment she stayed frozen, torn between memory and survival, between the man she had lost and the son she might still lose. Jack's words finally cut through her fear. Maybe this was why he had been spared, to carry Daniel's love forward. In her silence, the first fragile light of surrender and hope flickered. The surgery took hours that felt like years. Rachel sat in the waiting room, gripping the edge of her chair, praying with every breath. When Dr. Susan finally stepped out with a tired smile, Rachel's legs nearly gave out. The words were simple but life-changing. The surgery was successful. Ethan's heart was beating stronger. Rachel stood by his hospital bed later that night, listening to his breathing steady for the first time. Each rise and fall of his chest was like a miracle she had begged for in the darkest hours. She wept softly, not out of fear but out of relief, kissing his forehead again and again, as if to make up for every tear he had shed. Weeks later, when Ethan grew stronger, Rachel kept her promise to Jack. She walked into his store not as a customer but as an employee, ready to work. At first she swept floors, polished counters, and greeted guests with shy smiles. Slowly she learned the craft, her sincerity shining through more than any jewel. Customers began asking for her, drawn to the way she listened and cared. For Jack, the change was just as real. He found himself laughing more, sleeping deeper, and feeling lighter in Rachel's presence. The nightmares of sand and gunfire began to fade, replaced by the sound of Ethan's giggles echoing in the back of the shop. Side by side, they were healing, not just from war or loss, but from the weight of years that had kept them chained to grief. The hall was filled with the muted rustle of uniforms and the quiet presence of families holding framed photographs. A banner stretched across the stage, honoring those who had fallen, their names etched in solemn rows. Rachel walked beside Jack, carrying Ethan close, her steps heavy but steady as they approached the memorial table. In Jack's hands lay the silver chain, polished yet scarred, the engraving catching the soft light of the candles. His voice trembled as he placed it gently on the altar. He said he lived because Daniel had stepped into the path of death, and now he would live for Daniel, carrying his courage into every choice, every day. His words broke the silence, and heads bowed across the room. Rachel's arms tightened around Ethan as she bent her face to his tiny ear. She whispered that his father had been a hero, a man who gave everything so others could come home. She promised Ethan would grow up knowing that story, not as a tale of loss, but as a legacy of love and sacrifice. The child stirred, as if sensing the weight of her words, his breath steady against her skin. Then the trumpet began. A single mournful note rose into the air, curling through the hall like smoke, commanding stillness. The crowd stood in silence, tears glistening, hands pressed over hearts. For a few eternal minutes, the noise of the world faded, replaced only by the memory of those who had given their last breath. Jack stood motionless, eyes closed, his hand pressed against his chest, as though he could still feel Daniel's shield against him. Rachel stood beside him, her own tears flowing freely, but her heart stronger than it had ever been. Together, in that sacred moment, grief and pride intertwined, loss and healing became one, and Daniel's spirit lived on in both of them. 1 year later, Ethan ran across the park with the boundless energy of a child who had been given back his future. His laughter rang through the air as he tumbled into Rachel's arms, his cheeks flushed with life. Rachel held him close, marveling at how far they had come from the nights of sugar water and whispered prayers. Life had blossomed in ways she once thought impossible. She now managed Jack's jewelry store with quiet confidence, guiding customers with warmth that made them feel seen. Jack treated her like family, their bond built not on convenience but on sacrifice and trust. Together, they founded Daniel's Legacy, a fund that gave hope to widows and children of fallen soldiers. That evening, Rachel lit a candle in front of Daniel's photograph. Her voice shook as she told him his love had built more than survival. It had built a future, not just for her and Ethan, but for families who now stood taller because of his sacrifice. She whispered that his courage lived on in their son's heartbeat, steady and strong. The next morning, the store opened, with the light of dawn streaming through the windows. Inside the glass case near the entrance, the silver chain lay on velvet, polished to a soft glow. Rachel stood with Ethan at her side, Jack just behind them. Ethan's eyes fixed on the chain, and he tugged gently at Rachel's sleeve. His small voice broke the silence. "Dad." Rachel's breath caught as tears welled in her eyes. She bent down, pulling him into her arms, her face pressed into his hair. For a moment, it felt as though Daniel was standing there with them, smiling through his son. The chain glimmered in the morning light, no longer only a relic of loss, but a living symbol of love that refused to fade. From a desperate night in a broken apartment to the moment a single chain became the bridge between two lives, Rachel's story reminds us that love and sacrifice can reshape destiny. It teaches us that compassion, even born from pain, carries the power to heal families and even generations. What began as one mother's struggle now echoes as a reminder to the world that true wealth is measured in kindness, not gold. If this story touched you, share your feelings in the comments, like and subscribe to Emotional Echoes so more hearts can find hope. Thanks for listening.